It's a Tuesday morning at Fort Meade, Maryland, the secretive, sprawling headquarters of the National Security Agency. A senior analyst, one of the few with clearance high enough to have a name instead of just a number, sips his coffee in a windowless room known as a SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. On his screen are three streams of data. The first is a signals intercept from a Russian submarine. The second is a chatter analysis from a Chinese military satellite. This is his job. The third stream, however, is the one that causes the ulcer in his gut to flare. It's an intercept from an embassy in Washington, D.C., one sitting comfortably on International Drive just a few miles from the White House. It's the Israeli embassy. He and his colleagues are engaged in a full-spectrum offensive signals intelligence operation against the State of Israel. To the American public, this would be treason. To the politicians on Capitol Hill, it would be a diplomatic catastrophe. Israel is America's greatest ally, the special relationship, a bond forged in shared values and democratic ideals. But in the cold, subterranean world of U.S. intelligence, the operational directive is brutally simple. Israel is designated a hard target. It is a classification reserved for nations like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. The analyst isn't looking for terrorist threats to Israel. He's looking for terrorist threats from Israel, threats of espionage, theft, and political manipulation directed against the United States. To understand how this contradiction can exist, how a nation can be America's closest friend and, simultaneously, one of its most aggressive intelligence adversaries, you must understand the hidden history of its spy agency. This is not the story of the Mossad you see in movies, the heroic Nazi hunters and daring counter-terrorists. This is the story of the Mossad that operates in the shadows against its greatest benefactor. This is the story of an ally and an enemy. The organization, born in 1949, has a simple, chilling motto. By way of deception, thou shalt do war. Not by way of bullets or by way of diplomacy, by way of deception. The soul of the Mossad was forged in the ashes of the Holocaust. Its founding doctrine is not political, it is existential. It is the blood logic of never again. And never again means that the survival of the Jewish state is paramount, above all other laws, ethics, or alliances. Even, and perhaps especially, the alliance with the United States. For the first decades of its life, the Mossad's operations were a public relations dream for the West. They were the real-life good guys. In 1960, their agents, led by the legendary Rafi Eitan, located and snatched Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, from a street in Argentina. They drugged him, dressed him in a flight attendant's uniform, and flew him to Jerusalem to stand trial. It was an act of breathtaking justice. The U.S. and the entire Western world applauded. But in the shadows of this triumph, Mossad was already engaged in its first and perhaps most significant act of betrayal against the United States. It was called the Numek Affair. In the 1960s, Israel had a problem. Its Arab neighbors, vastly superior in numbers and vowing to drive the Jews into the sea, were building up conventional armies. Israel knew it could not survive a war of attrition. It needed an insurance policy. It needed a nuclear bomb. The U.S. government under Kennedy and Johnson was staunchly opposed. They would give Israel planes and tanks, but not the bomb. The risk of global nuclear proliferation was too high. Israel, however, was not asking for permission. In the sleepy town of Apollo, Pennsylvania, a scientist named Zalman Shapiro ran a nuclear processing plant called NUMEC, Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation. Shapiro was a brilliant scientist and a passionate Zionist. He also had regular visitors to his plant. Among them, according to declassified FBI and CIA files, was Rafi Eitan himself, the same hero who had captured Eichmann. Between 1965 and 1968, U.S. nuclear auditors began to notice something terrifying. Over 300 kilograms of highly enriched weapons-grade uranium had been missing from the plant. It had simply vanished. The Atomic Energy Commission, the FBI, and the CIA launched a quiet, panicked investigation. Their top suspect, the Mossad. The theory was simple.
Shapiro, guided by his Israeli handlers, had been smuggling out samples of uranium, a little bit at a time, perhaps in lunchboxes, perhaps in false-bottomed containers, which were then spirited away to Israel. It was, as one CIA document later stated, the original sin. Mossad, the agency of America's ally, had allegedly orchestrated the largest theft of nuclear material in U.S. history from under the nose of the U.S. government to build the one weapon the U.S. had forbidden them from having. When CIA Director Helms was later asked if he believed the Mossad stole the uranium, his answer was chillingly direct: "I had no doubt." The New Mech affair set the playbook for the next 50 years. Publicly, a handshake. Privately, a knife in the back. The 1980s marked the golden age of the U.S.-Israel public relationship. President Reagan saw Israel as a vital bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East. But behind the scenes, the Mossad and its military intelligence equivalent, LACOM, launched their most brazen operation ever, one that would shatter the illusion of trust for a generation. Its name was Jonathan Pollard. Pollard was not a Mossad agent. He was an American, a U.S. Navy intelligence analyst. He was also arrogant, deeply insecure, and held a fervent ideological belief that the U.S. was not doing enough to protect Israel. In 1984, he walked into the Israeli embassy and offered his services.
LACOM, Israel's Bureau of Scientific Relations, couldn't believe their luck. Mossad had a rule against running American Jewish agents, seeing it as too risky. LACOM, hungry for technological secrets, had no such scruples. For 18 months, Jonathan Pollard became the most devastating traitor in American history. He wasn't just giving Israel information on its Arab neighbors, information the U.S. was already sharing, albeit filtered. Pollard was giving them everything. He delivered suitcases full of classified documents, sometimes twice a week. He gave them the keys to the kingdom, the entire U.S. Signals Intelligence National Level, or SIGINT, manual, which detailed how America spied on the world. He gave them the names of thousands of U.S. informants and assets inside the Soviet Union and across the Arab world. He gave them U.S. satellite imagery, data on U.S. nuclear submarine capabilities, and electronic fingerprints of every weapon in the American arsenal. When Pollard was finally caught in 1985, after a desperate, failed plea for asylum at the Israeli embassy, the American intelligence community was apoplectic. Israel, they realized, had not just used Pollard to get information on its enemies, it had used him to get information on the United States. Worse, there was sickening evidence that Israel had traded this information. Many of the U.S. assets in the Soviet Union whose names Pollard had stolen were subsequently captured or killed. The implication was horrifying. Had Israel traded America's most sensitive secrets to the USSR in exchange for the release of Soviet Jews? The damage was incalculable. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger wrote an infamous memo to the court, arguing that Pollard's treason was so severe that he should never be released. He stated that it was difficult to conceive of a greater harm to the national security. Israel, for its part, issued a formal apology. It was a rogue operation, they claimed, a terrible mistake. They promised it would never happen again. The U.S. intelligence community knew this was a lie, and the proof was already in their systems. While Pollard was stealing paper, Mossad was busy with a far more insidious operation. It was a high-tech heist involving a piece of software called PROMIS. PROMIS, Prosecutors Management Information System, was a revolutionary piece of case management software developed by a small U.S. company called Inslaw. In the early 1980s, the U.S. Department of Justice acquired it, and, according to multiple investigations and sworn testimony, promptly gave a copy to the Mossad. Mossad, working with legendary spy and media tycoon Robert Maxwell, allegedly did something brilliant. They bugged the software, creating a backdoor that only they could access. Then they sold it. Through a network of front companies, Mossad sold this compromised version of PROMIS to intelligence agencies and governments all over the world. They sold it to their friends, like the UK and Australia, and they sold it to their enemies, like Iraq, Libya, and Syria. It was even, some claim, sold back to U.S. agencies like the Los Alamos National Laboratory. For the Mossad, it was the perfect intelligence weapon. It was a Trojan horse. From their headquarters in Tel Aviv, they could allegedly log in to the secure intelligence databases of their enemies and their friends. They could see what secrets the U.S. was keeping at its nuclear labs. They could track what cases the U.S. Department of Justice was building. They were ghosts in the machine. When the Inslaw scandal broke, it was a conspiracy theory too complex for the public to grasp. But for the NSA, it was a terrifying wake-up call. Their ally wasn't just stealing their files. They were building the digital skeleton keys to walk in and take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. The tension came to a head in the year America's sense of invulnerability was shattered. In the 2 years prior to September 11, 2001, a strange phenomenon was sweeping the country. Hundreds of young, charismatic Israelis, mostly ex-military, were fanning out across the U.S., claiming to be art students. They went door to door, selling cheap, sentimental paintings. But they weren't just visiting suburbs. They were targeting the homes of U.S. federal officials, DEA agents, FBI agents, Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA personnel. They were trying to get inside federal buildings. A 2001 U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration report, later leaked to the press, compiled a list of over 120 of these art students, detailing their highly suspicious activities. The report noted that the students were often ex-military intelligence or electronics experts. They were systematic. They were trying to penetrate secure facilities. The DEA concluded they were part of an organized intelligence gathering operation. But this is where the story turns dark. The largest and most aggressive cell of these art students was not based in Washington, D.C. or New York. It was based in Hollywood, Florida. It was the same small, unassuming Florida town where at that exact same time, 5 of the 9/11 hijackers, including their leader, Mohammed Atta, were living and planning their attack. After 9/11, U.S. investigators, trying to piece together what had happened, stumbled upon this horrifying coincidence. Had a Mossad-run surveillance operation been monitoring the hijackers? A 2002 investigation by Fox News and Le Monde uncovered evidence that the Israelis were at the minimum monitoring the terror cells. This raised a question so monstrous that the U.S. government has never dared to answer it publicly. Did the Mossad know about the 9/11 plot? And if they knew, did they warn their greatest ally? The official Israel answer is that they provided a general warning of a large-scale terrorist attack, but had no specific intelligence. But in the halls of the CIA and FBI, the art student file is a wound that will not heal. The suspicion is that Mossad, true to its code, was monitoring the cells for its own protection. Their job was to find out if the terrorists posed a threat to Israel, and since the plot was directed at the United States, they may have simply watched. To warn the U.S. would have required them to admit how they got the information, to expose their vast, illegal intelligence network operating inside America. And so, in the cold calculus of never again, the survival of their operation took precedence over the 3,000 lives lost on that clear September morning. Or so the enemy theory goes. The ally theory is that they, like the U.S., did not have the specific data to stop the attack. The truth, as with all things Mossad, is buried in deception. This is the central paradox. The story of Mossad is not of good or evil. It is one of singular, terrifying focus. When a joint U.S. Mossad operation was needed to cripple Iran's nuclear program, the two agencies worked hand in glove. Together, they created Stuxnet, the world's first digital superweapon, a computer virus so advanced it physically destroyed Iranian centrifuges. It was a masterpiece of Allied cooperation. When ISIS emerged, Mossad intelligence considered the best in the Middle East was shared with U.S. forces, saving American lives. The Mossad is America's ally. But at the same time, the FBI's counterintelligence division consistently ranks Israel as one of the most prolific and aggressive espionage threats in the world. They target U.S. technology, buy influence on Capitol Hill, and run sources inside the U.S. government. The Mossad is America's enemy. Back at Fort Meade, the analyst closes the intercept file from the Israeli embassy. He knows the truth. Israel is not a friend, it is not an enemy, it is a partner. In the same way two apex predators might partner to take down larger prey, all while knowing that if one of them shows weakness, the other will not hesitate to strike. The special relationship is a reality for politicians, but for the spies who guard America's secrets, the relationship is a permanent, high-stakes game. And the Mossad, guided by its ghosts and its ruthless, uncompromising motto, will never, ever stop playing.